all awash. I think I'm going to founder through the crackling static on May 11th, 1953. The voice of Captain Albert Stiglin pierced the radio of the Wilfred Sykes like a ghost emerging from the abyss. Just hours earlier, Lake Superior had been a sunlit mirror eerily calm at a temperature of 24 degrees Celsius. For the SS Henry Steinbrenner, a steel veteran with 50 years of service, it was just another routine run. But beneath this spring paradise, a legendary killer was stirring 6 months ahead of schedule. As the sky turned a bruised purple, the Steinbrenner faced a mechanical betrayal. Why did her massive steel hatches built to withstand the inland seas suddenly vanish? Was it a freak of nature or a fatal flaw hidden in her aging joints? What forced an elite captain into a gamble that would haunt maritime history forever? Stay with us until the very end as we uncover a tragedy where every decision was a roll of the dice with the abyss. And to answer the final haunting question, in a world of steel and storms, who will survive when the sea decides to change the rules? The SS Henry Steinbrenner was a vessel that seemed to carry a shadow from the moment of her inception. Built in 1901 by the Port Huron Shipbuilding Company, she was designated as Hull Number 14, a number that many superstitious sailors would already view with caution. Her very first moments of existence were defined by a brush with destruction. A massive fire erupted near her slipway on September 28, 1901, forcing workers to launch her prematurely just to escape the encroaching flames. In the maritime world, a rushed, chaotic baptism is a stain on a ship's soul, a sign that she is a vessel destined for a life of misfortune. Physically, the Steinbrenner was a 427-foot steel workhorse, a staple of the Kinsman Transit Company. She was designed to haul 6,500 tons of iron ore, the raw fuel for America's industrial expansion. However, by the early 1950s, she had become a steel ship with a wooden mindset. Her deck featured 12 telescoping hatch covers, a 19th century design consisting of steel plates that slid over one another. To make these hatches truly watertight, the crew was required to manually stretch heavy, cumbersome canvas tarpaulins over them, secured by 28 Molen clamps per hatch. It was a primitive, labor-intensive system that relied on the sheer muscle of sailors to hold back the fury of the inland seas. Her 50-year career was a grim roadmap of scars and structural traumas. Only 8 years after her launch on December 5, 1909, she collided with the Harry A. Berwind in the St. Mary's River, sinking into the mud. The salvage operation was a brutal ordeal, costing $30,000, an astronomical sum at the time, and requiring divers to work beneath a foot of ice through a harsh Michigan winter just to patch her 25-foot gash. Even after she was raised, the accidents didn't stop a collision with the John McCarthy in 1923 and a violent ramming of a lock wall at the Sioux in 1941. By 1953, she was a patched-up veteran, the oldest and most weary vessel in the Kinsman fleet. While she had technically passed her American Bureau of Shipping inspection in dry dock just months earlier, the men who actually lived in her steel belly, like 19-year-old Kenneth Cum, saw a different reality. To the owners in Cleveland, she was a profitable asset, but to Cum, she was a shivering giant. He noticed that the critical Molen clamps, the only things keeping the lake out of the cargo holds, were often stripped of their threads and persistently loose. The Steinbrenner also lacked a functional radar and had no internal tunnel connecting the bow to the stern. If a storm hit, the crew was trapped. Their only lifeline was a terrifying run across an open, freezing deck. This created a lethal contrast between the Steinbrenner and the new titans of the lake, like the SS Wilfred Sykes. While the Sykes represented the future with modern radar and hydraulic hatch covers, the Steinbrenner remained a 19th century ghost. She was heading into the 1953 season with aging joints and a primitive defense system. At 5 a.m. on May 10th, 1953, that steel-old veteran, along with a crew of 31, began its voyage from the Great Northern Railway dock in Superior, Wisconsin. Deep within her cargo hold sat 6,800 tons of iron ore, a heavy, dense burden destined for the Bethlehem steel mills on Lake Erie. To any observer watching from the shore, it was a picture-perfect spring morning. The sky was a vast, unbroken dome of blue, and the mercury was already climbing toward an unseasonable 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Lake Superior, a body of water infamous for its unpredictable fury, lay as smooth and glass-like as a backyard pond. It was a scene of serene beauty that created a profound sense of security, a psychological trap that would soon prove fatal. Captain Albert Stiglin, a man with 27 years of experience on the lakes, stepped onto the bridge with the routine confidence of a seasoned navigator. He was aware of the ship's limitations. Most notably, her radar system was broken. On a day with unlimited visibility, this seemed like a minor inconvenience. However, the most critical decision made in those early hours happened on the spar deck. As the ship steamed into open water, Stiglin made the choice to leave the heavy canvas tarpaulins stored away. The 12 telescoping hatches were secured only by their manual Moulin clamps. To understand this decision, we must analyze the economic gamble of the 1950s shipping industry. Companies like Kinsman Transit operated on razor-thin margins, where a ship only generated revenue when moving cargo. Battening down tarpaulins was a grueling multi-hour ordeal that required the entire deck crew to lug massive water-heavy rolls of canvas across the deck, stretching them over the steel plates and hand-tightening dozens of clamps. It was back-breaking work that exhausted the men. With a forecast predicting only light 30 miles per hour, Wins Stiglin acted more as a manager protecting his crew's energy and the company's schedule than a cautious sailor. He was unknowingly gambling against a rare atmospheric collision that was already brewing on the horizon. By 3 p.m., the May Witch began to stir. The mirror-like surface of the lake didn't just ripple, it shattered. A massive front of warm, moist air surging from the Gulf of Mexico slammed into a wall of cold, dense air sitting over the 35-degree waters of the lake. This created a localized zone of extreme low pressure, birthing a storm with a ferocity usually reserved for the lethal gales of November. In mere minutes, the temperature differential fueled a rapid intensification of winds, surging from a gentle breeze to a screaming 80-mile-per-hour gale. The peaceful spring day was gone, replaced by a vertical wall of gray water and screaming wind. The geography of the Great Lakes now turned deadly. Unlike the deep oceans where waves have thousands of miles to develop long rhythmic swells, the Great Lakes produce steep and sharp waves. Because the lakes are shallower and the fetch, the distance wind travels over water, is limited, the waves are packed closely together. For the low-riding Steinbrenner, this was a mechanical nightmare. She couldn't recover between hits. Before her bow could rise from the trough of one wave, the next was already crashing over her forecastle. This constant bombardment created a lethal pumping effect on the telescoping hatches. As thousands of tons of green water hammered the deck, the air trapped beneath the steel plates was violently compressed, creating immense upward pressure that fought against the aging Molen clamps. Because the Steinbrenner lacked the internal passageway as analyzed above, this meant that by 4:30 p.m., the crew had effectively been split in two. The sailors and officers at the bow were cut off from the galley and the warmth of the engine room at the stern by 120 meters of exposed deck that had become a dead zone of freezing water. If a man wanted to eat or report for duty, he had to gamble his life against the waves. The telescoping design of the Steinbrenner's hatches was proving to be a catastrophic liability. Without the protective canvas tarpaulins, the very ones Captain Stiglin had gambled away earlier that morning, the steel plates were naked against the hydraulic hammer of the lake. Every time a steep and sharp wave slammed into the spar deck, it didn't just wash over, it pressurized. A deck watch crawling along the lifeline witnessed the nightmare. Hatch 11 was breathing. The steel plates were lifting inches into the air, the worn Molen clamps rattling violently as their stripped threads groaned under the strain. Third mate. George Wiseman knew that if Hatch 11 failed, the ship's buoyancy would vanish. He gathered 3 volunteer deckhands for a mission that bordered on suicidal. Tied to a single fraying lifeline, they descended from the aft deckhouse into the kill zone. The water was a staggering 35 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that triggers immediate cold shock, yet these men worked in it waist deep. As they struggled to hand-tighten the vibrating clamps, a rogue wave, a massive wall of water swept the deck. One sailor was launched 15 feet into the air like a rag doll. The crew watched in horror as he was dropped directly into the dark gaping maw of the open cargo hold, falling nearly 15 feet onto the hard iron ore below. By a miracle of fate, he survived the fall and was hauled out by his gasping crewmates. They managed to wedge the hatch shut one last time, but the effort had broken them. They retreated to the stern, physically spent and shivering, knowing the fix was only temporary. As midnight passed and the calendar turned to May 11th, the Steinbrenner entered her final act. The storm intensified with sustained winds screaming at 80 miles per hour. The waves were now monstrous, reaching heights of 35 feet taller than many of the buildings in the towns the sailors called home. The 50-year-old steel hull was screaming. Every time the ship dived into a trough, the structural groaning could be heard over the roar of the gale. The weight of the ship was changing. The 6,800 tons of iron ore had begun to absorb the thousands of gallons of water that had leaked through the compromised hatches. Iron ore liquefaction is a silent killer. As the ore became a slurry, the ship lost its righting arm. She became sluggish, responding to the rudder with a sickening delay. Down in the engine room, the oiler reported a terrifying sight. A wave so massive had crashed over the stern that water was pouring down the ship's funnel, threatening to douse the Scotch Marine boilers and leave the ship dead in the water. At 4:30 a.m., the inevitable occurred. Hatch 11, battered beyond endurance, finally broke loose for good. The clamps snapped like dry twigs. There was no longer any possibility of sending men back out. The deck was now a permanent part of the lake. Stiglin watched from the bridge as the stern began to settle. The ship was no longer riding the waves. She was being dragged under by them. By dawn, the Steinbrenner was a ghost of a ship. At 6 a.m., the final mechanical betrayal began. The influx of water into the aft holds began to drown the engine room. The lights flickered and died, plunging the crew into a terrifying pitch-black labyrinth as the ship lost all electrical power. The steering gear failed. The Steinbrenner drifted sideways into the troughs, allowing the waves to roll her violently. It was during this period that the wooden doors of the pilot house were simply punched in by the weight of a wave flooding the bridge and destroying the ship's internal communications. Captain Stiglin, now standing in a flooded bridge, realized the gamble was over. At 7 a.m., he broadcast his first desperate call for help. 6 vessels responded, including the modern Titan SS Wilfred Sykes, which began racing toward their coordinates south of Isle Royale. But the Steinbrenner didn't have hours, she had minutes. By 7:30 a.m. hatches 10 and 12 had also failed, fully exposing the rear of the ship to the lake. At 7:36 a.m., Captain Stiglin ordered the general alarm, 7 short blasts, and 1 long blast of the ship's whistle, the universal signal for abandoned ship. The sound was barely audible over the screeching wind. The ship was now sinking stern first at a terrifying angle. Kenneth Cum, the 19-year-old who had sensed the ship's fragility days ago, rushed to the deck. He saw Isle Royale in the far distance, a tantalizing sliver of land, and considered jumping to swim for it. An older sailor stopped him, shouting that the 35-degree water would kill him in minutes. As the stern plunged, a massive wave swept over the deck, washing Cum overboard and dragging him toward the aft of the ship. He recalled seeing the cavernous open cargo holds passing beneath him like the ribs of a dying whale. Suddenly, a massive jolt of heat surged past him. The ship's boilers had exploded as the frigid lake water hit the superheated steel. The SS Henry Steinbrenner gave one final violent shudder and vanished beneath the surface 15 miles south of Isle Royale Light. The water temperature in Lake Superior in May is around 36 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, the human body doesn't simply feel cold, it goes into catastrophic shock. Within seconds, the cold shock response triggers uncontrollable gasping, which often leads to drowning if the victim is submerged. Within minutes, blood is shunted away from the extremities to protect the core organs, leading to a total loss of manual dexterity. For the survivors of the Steinbrenner, their hands became useless claws, unable to grasp ropes or pull themselves onto life rafts. They were not just fighting the waves, they were fighting a biological countdown toward cardiac arrest. Kenneth Cum found himself only a few feet away from the port lifeboat, which had floated free as the stern sank. But the boat was a hollow victory. It had jammed in its davits during the sinking and was now almost entirely swamped with water. Inside were 21-year-old second cook Bernard Oboski and Frank Tomac. Cum, a large man weighing 225 pounds, realized his size was both a blessing and a curse. His body fat provided a meager insulation against the cold, but his weight made climbing into the flooded boat nearly impossible. With agonizing effort, he managed to roll his body over the gunwale. The 3 men sat in a boat that was effectively a bathtub in the middle of a hurricane. They had no buckets to bail, and even if they did, their frozen fingers couldn't have held them. Wave after wave crashed over the side, keeping the boat submerged to the seats. Cum later recalled the psychological toll of watching Frank Tomac lose consciousness. As Tomac slipped overboard into the gray void, Cum and Oboski summoned a final desperate surge of adrenaline to haul him back in. They were drifting in a gray world where the line between life and death was as thin as the wet fabric of their life jackets. Half a mile away, Captain Albert Stiglin was facing an even bleaker reality. He and 9 other men had managed to scramble onto a small wood-frame life raft measuring only 6 by 12 feet. This wasn't a boat. It was merely a platform of air tanks and wooden slats designed to keep men above the surface. In the violent 30-foot swells, the raft was a plaything for the May Witch. Within minutes of the ship sinking, a massive cresting wave flipped the raft entirely. The men were tossed back into the 35-degree water. Stiglin and 5 others managed to claw their way back onto the slippery wood, but 4 men, their strength evaporated by the cold, simply vanished into the foam. For the 6 remaining on the raft, the situation was a psychological nightmare. They were completely exposed to the wind with no gunwales to protect them from the spray. Every wave threatened to wash them off again. Stiglin, the man who had made the fateful gamble with the tarpaulins, now sat in silence, watching his crew perish in the very waters he had navigated for nearly 3 decades. The weight of command had transformed into the weight of mourning. The survivors drifted for over 4 agonizing hours. Visibility was near zero due to the driving sleet and spray. The men were suffering from advanced hypothermia. Their speech became slurred, and a deadly lethality began to set in. In the later stages of hypothermia, the mind often plays tricks. Some sailors reported a strange urge to simply let go and sleep in the water, a phenomenon known as the umbilical pull of the deep. The psychological battle was as intense as the physical one. On the raft, the men had to constantly shout at one another to stay awake. On the swamped lifeboats, they watched the horizon with salt-crusty eyes, looking for any sign of the ships that had answered their SOS. They knew that the Wilfred Sykes and the Joseph H. Thompson were out there racing through the storm, but in the vast, churning expanse of Lake Superior, a small gray boat or a wooden raft is nearly invisible. Every time a wave lifted them to a crest, they searched for a mast or a plume of smoke, only to be dropped back into the trough with nothing but the scream of the wind for company. This was the moment they truly realized that Technology Steel Engine's radio had betrayed them. All that remained was the primal will of 14 men to keep breathing in a world that wanted to freeze them solid. They were suspended in a frozen void, caught between the ghost of the Steinbrenner below and an uncertain rescue above. While 14 men clung to life in the freezing spray of Lake Superior, a mechanical titan was charging through the chaos toward them. This was the SS Wilfred Sykes, a vessel that didn't just represent a rescue party, but a completely different era of maritime engineering. Launched only 4 years prior, the Sykes was hailed as the Queen of the Lakes. At 671 feet long, she was a sleek modern marvel equipped with state-of-the-art radar and, most crucially, one-piece steel hydraulic hatch covers. While the Steinbrenner was a 19th century ghost dying of old-world flaws, the Sykes was the cutting-edge future. The image of the Sykes appearing through the sleet was the ultimate contrast, the new world arriving to pull the survivors out of a disaster caused by the old world. It was a confrontation between a ship that had failed its men and a ship designed to defy the very elements that broke the Steinbrenner. Finding a swamped lifeboat or a tiny wooden raft in an 80-mile-per-hour gale with near-zero visibility is a task that defies logic. It is like searching for a needle in a churning gray haystack. Captain George Fisher of the Wilfred Sykes pushed his engines to the structural limit, the hull vibrating under the strain as his radar swept the chaotic surface for any anomaly. At approximately 11 a.m., nearly 4 hours after the Steinbrenner vanished, a lookout on the Sykes spotted a flash of orange, the half-submerged port lifeboat pitching violently on the crest of a massive wave. What followed was a harrowing display of precision seamanship that remains a case study in Great Lakes history. Captain Fisher had to maneuver a 20,000-ton steel giant alongside a fragile waterlogged boat without crushing it or losing it in the troughs. He brought the Sykes upwind to create a lee, a temporary patch of calmer water shielded by the ship's massive hull. Kenneth Cum, barely conscious and his hands frozen into useless claws, watched as a Jacob's ladder was lowered down the side of the steel cliff. Cum was the first to grab hold. With the last of his strength, he clung to the rope as the Sykes crew hauled the ladder upward, dragging his 225-pound frame onto the deck. But as they reached for the remaining 2 men, a monster wave slammed into the Sykes, forcing the ship away from the lifeboat. It took Captain Fisher over an hour of agonizing tight maneuvering in the storm to bring the massive freighter back around for a second pass. Eventually, 9 volunteers from the Sykes lowered their own lifeboat to facilitate the rescue. They pulled Bernard Oboski and Frank Tomac on board, but for Tomac, the May Witch had already collected her toll. Despite the warmth of the Sykes galley and the desperate efforts of her crew, Frank Tomac passed away shortly after being rescued, his body finally surrendering to the profound hypothermia. Simultaneously, the SS Joseph H. Thompson located Captain Stiglin's 6-by-12-foot raft. The 6 survivors were hauled from the wooden slats just as the cold was beginning to shut down their internal organs. Nearby, the DM Clemson performed a similarly treacherous maneuver to rescue the 7 men in the starboard lifeboat, narrowly avoiding a disaster where the lifeboat almost drifted into the ship's massive churning propeller. Out of the 31 men who had set out from Superior, Wisconsin, 14 were saved. Of the 31 men who departed from Superior, Wisconsin, 14 were rescued, 10 bodies were recovered from the water, and 7 others were never found, becoming part of the lake's grim statistics. The physical rescue ended at the docks, but the moral and legal rescue of the truth began on May 18, 1953, when the Marine Board of Investigation convened. The inquiry was a collision of perspectives that would haunt the industry for decades. The survivors were brought forward to testify, and their accounts painted a picture of a ship that was literally falling apart. Several crew members criticized the 52-year-old Steinbrenner as unseaworthy, pointing to the stripped threads on the Molin clamps and the broken radar as evidence of criminal negligence by the Kinsman Transit Company. They argued that the ship was a rust bucket, pushed beyond its limits by corporate greed. But the biggest issue raised was that Captain Stiglin did not order tarpaulins to be secured over the hatches. The Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation reviewed all of these issues. The Steinbrenner had been inspected by the insurance company on May 4, 1953, and was found to be in satisfactory condition. The vessel had also been placed in dry dock for its regular 5-year inspection in February 1953, and had passed both that inspection and its annual survey. The board found no evidence that any stripped clamps were present on the 3 aftermost hatches that failed, concluding that stripped clamps could be tightened like any others if their threads were wrapped with line, and that news reports regarding the clamps had been exaggerated. Operating the vessel in heavy seas caused the hatch clamps to loosen, and large waves knocked the loosened clamps free. The hatch covers no longer secured by the clamps were then torn away by the seas. Regarding tarpaulins, the board concluded that if they had been used, they would have helped reduce the general working and loosening of all clamps and would have helped prevent the free ingress of water between the hatch sections. However, in its most controversial ruling, the board did not blame Stiglitz for failing to rig tarpaulins. It concluded that any prudent master would have made the same decision based on the conditions and weather forecast at the time. The board declared that Stiglin was not guilty of negligence and concluded that the sinking was an act of God. But the story didn't end with the board's report. The commandant of the Coast Guard at the time took the rare step of strongly disagreeing with the board's findings. He argued that maritime safety regulations were absolute, not situational. The law stated that exposed cargo hatches must be properly secured before leaving protected waters, regardless of the forecast. By skipping the tarpaulins to save time and effort, the economic gamble, Stiglin had fundamentally violated his duty of care. This sparked a deep debate on maritime ethics. Where does the line fall between a captain's discretion and a captain's negligence? To the owners, the pressure to maintain schedules was a silent mandate, a culture of speed that permeated the lakes. To the Coast Guard, the regulations were written in the blood of previous shipwrecks. Ultimately, the commandant's view prevailed. Captain Albert Stiglin was stripped of his master's license. He was not sent to prison, but he was forever cast out from the profession he had served for nearly 30 years. He became the scapegoat for a system that encouraged risk-taking while demanding total safety. The board's decision may have been influenced by the weather conditions. To give you an idea of just how severe the weather was that day, on May 10th, a tornado outbreak struck northwest Wisconsin and southeast Minnesota. 4 of them were F4 tornadoes with winds reaching up to 260 miles per hour. A 5th tornado was rated F3. The temperature in Superior dropped by 40 degrees overnight. The weather system appeared to extend as far south as Texas, where 34 people were killed and 400 were injured by 2 tornadoes. Another Great Lakes captain with 44 years of experience said it was the worst storm he had ever witnessed. The tragedy of the SS Henry Steinbrenner remains a pivotal case study in the human element of disasters. It highlights a recurring theme in Great Lakes history, the transition from a steel and brawn era to a technology and regulation era. The 17 men who died weren't just victims of a storm, they were victims of a transitional period where old ships were being pushed to keep up with a new world. The rescue by the Wilfred Sykes was more than a lucky break, it was a glimpse of what safety could look like. The Sykes had modern hatches that didn't require tarpaulins or manual clamps. Had the Steinbrenner possessed such technology, the May Witch would have been just another windy day. The SS Henry Steinbrenner now rests in the silent, pressurized darkness of Lake Superior, nearly 600 feet below the surface. Modern shipwreck explorers and sonar technicians who have surveyed her grave find a haunting monument to that fateful May morning. The hull sits upright, but it is a broken veteran. The most chilling sight for those who study the wreckage is the state of hatches 10, 11, and 12. They are not merely open, they are mangled, the heavy steel plates twisted like tin foil by the immense hydraulic pressure of the sinking and the explosive force of the air trapped within. It is a physical confirmation of the frantic testimony given by the survivors. The old world's clamps simply could not hold back the new world's fury. Among the 14 men who climbed out of the icy abyss in 1953 was a sailor named Norm Bragg. For years, Bragg lived with the weight of being a survivor, a man who had cheated the May Witch. But in the lore of the Great Lakes, some say the lake never truly forgets a debt. 13 years later, on November 29, 1966, Bragg found himself on the deck of another aging freighter, the 603-foot SS Daniel J. Morrell, caught in a brutal storm on Lake Huron. History didn't just rhyme, it repeated itself with terrifying symmetry. As the Morrell began to break in two, Bragg found himself once again facing a freezing vortex. In his final moments, demonstrating a stoicism that defines the men of the lakes, he turned to his shipmates and simply said, "It's been good to know you." He went down with the ship, becoming one of the very few men in history to survive one major Great Lakes shipwreck, only to perish in another of equal magnitude. It forces a profound question. Was this a cruel twist of fate, a mathematical impossibility, Or did the lake merely wait 13 years to collect what it was owed? The story of Norm. Bragg remains one of the most unsettling ghost stories in maritime history. A reminder that on these waters, survival is often just a temporary reprieve. To view the Steinbrenner in isolation is to miss its most significant historical warning. This tragedy was a sneak preview, a grim dress rehearsal for the most famous maritime disaster in inland history, the loss of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald in 1975. The parallels are bone-chilling. Both ships were heavily loaded with iron ore. Both were battling extreme pressure systems. And most importantly, both disasters centered on the failure of hatch covers. While the Fitzgerald was far larger and more modern, the core vulnerability remained the same. The Steinbrenner proved that if the integrity of the hatches is compromised, an ore carrier becomes a sinking stone. Had the maritime industry fully absorbed the lessons of the Steinbrenner's Molen clamps and the catastrophic risk of skipping tarpaulins, the regulations surrounding hatch security might have been stringent enough to save the 29 men on the Fitzgerald 22 years later. The Steinbrenner is the missing link in a chain of negligence that proves maritime safety is often bought with the lives of those who go before. The Steinbrenner disaster was ultimately a clash between human ego and natural reality. It was a story of a steel ship with a wooden mindset where an elite captain made an economic gamble that the weather decided to call. It serves as a permanent cold reminder that the Great Lakes do not recognize the calendar. A which can be just as lethal as a November gale, and a worn screw on a hatch clamp can be as deadly as a hole in the hull. As we look back at the 17 men who remain in the deep, we are left with the image of Kenneth Combs' frozen hands and Captain Stiglin's silenced career. We learn that in the shipping industry, progress is often measured in wreckage. The Steinbrenner didn't just sink, she paved the way for the total overhaul of hatch designs and weather reporting that protects sailors today. But as the wind howls across Lake Superior, today one can't help but wonder, in our modern age of satellite tracking and unsinkable hulls, are we still making economic gambles that nature is waiting to exploit? The Steinbrenner reminds us that the rules of the water are written in iron and ice, and for those who forget them, the lake is always ready to settle the score. Finally, we pause to honor the 17 brave souls lost to the May Witch on May 11th, 1953. May their names be remembered and their spirits find peace in the silent halls of the deep. Before we conclude today's message, thank you for standing with us on this journey into the depths of Lake Superior. If the story of the Steinbrenner moved you, please consider liking and sharing this video. Your support helps us keep the memory of these mariners alive. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next investigation into the shadows of the sea. The lakes are vast, but the stories are personal. If you have a connection to this tragedy or another maritime legend, please share it with us in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, we'll see you in the next video. Stay safe on the water.